another story of the same. You know, we're having a good time. But just be respectful, dudes, and never learn.
Does that mean you're rolling?
Tell us
With the homies.
Rolling.
Welcome to the Baltimore Bureau Podcast. Good morning. We are here today with a fairly short show. We had a little bit of a longer one last week, trying to keep you on your toes, so we have a slightly shorter one this week. I'm Dharna and I'm here with my co-host, Khalilah. If you are watching instead of just listening, then you might notice that we did some cool stuff with the cameras, so we might look a little bit better.
Right.
For y'all. So what do we have this week, Khalilah?
So first and foremost, we have the Baltimore City Police budget was revealed and showed, I think, $42 million over in overtime. And Baltimore City Council, we had Taya Graham attend the Baltimore City Council hearing where they were reviewing this budget, and they are making demands to have a weekly review of a detailed budget. Just saw, I think, USA Today did a story about the fact that Baltimore City Police seem to have stopped policing.
Yeah, but you heard it here first.
But you heard it here first on the Real News. Let's be clear. The challenge is, what are you getting overtime for if you're not arresting, if you're not policing, if you're not out in the community? I hope it's not for directing traffic or anything like that.
Yeah, or worse.
Right.
Directing traffic or much worse.
Right.
Yeah, they talk in the story about how few police on the police force actually spend their time patrolling, which is interesting that then we would have over $30 million in overtime. And yeah, so Councilman Leon Pinkett put forth this resolution to demand some more transparency from the BPD. Jack Young seems to be behind it. Our council president, Jack Young, seems to be backing it as well. So we'll see if this can make some impact. Sounds like they're really trying.
Yeah, well, maybe they can redirect some of those funds to invest in communities that won't need to be policed.
Yeah, maybe some schools, maybe some better infrastructure.
Housing, go figure.
Yeah. All right, so let's take a look.
This is Taya Graham reporting for the Real News Network in Baltimore City, Maryland. For years, the Baltimore City Police Department has had a blank check for their overtime, but now our city council is fighting back.
I mean, it's like they have an open checkbook.
The Baltimore Police Department already consumes roughly half of the city's discretionary spending, nearly $500 million in the next current fiscal year, a number that continues to grow, particularly because year in and year out, the department exceeds its overtime budget. Last year, that meant an extra $36 million, which is why the council is now pushing back.
Some people will ask, well, why are we doing this and why is it necessary? When we look at last year's fiscal budget, even prior before it got to the council by our first quarter milestone, the police department was already $17 million in the deficit as it relates to overtime.
Today, Councilman Leon Pinkett introduced a resolution that calls on the department to provide monthly briefings on overtime spending, a move that Pinkett says is long overdue.
You know, and if we as a council don't intervene, we've really created a culture where the police department has become accustomed to exceeding their budget and then coming and asking for additional money for overtime. And there are too many other needs that our city has and for us to give almost $500 million towards police and then know that at the end of the budget cycle, there's an anticipation of another almost $20 million. The city can't continue to do that.
It's a new sense of urgency to council oversight that Council President Jack Young also supports.
Are you expecting details about where this is going?
We're expecting details of everything that we asked for. And if we don't get it, they're going to have a problem with their budget because the budget have to come through this council.
One key question remains unanswered. The department has often justified overtime spending by citing shortages of patrol. But the police department recently confirmed that only 37% of sworn officers serve in patrol, raising a question we asked Councilman Pinkett. Where is the money actually going?
You know, have they given you any sense of whether it's patrol officers getting over, what the percentage of officers getting overtime, like patrol versus officers who are in specialized units? I mean, if we look at the gun trace task force, they were eating up a lot of overtime. Are they going to give you that kind of detail so you can really manage them?
That's our expectation. That we are. This is about transparency, not only for the council but also for the constituents of the city. And we want to know what is driving the overtime. What are the reasons, and really really looking at those and then making, suggestions, recommendations, developing a strategy on how we can address those.
Adding to the mystery is a much anticipated audit of overtime, which city officials refuse to release.
The people working on the audit are working under the direction and supervision of attorneys. So I can't say anything more.
City officials told The Real News that the audit was attorney-client work product for a lawsuit filed by the police union that claims that officers have been deprived of overtime. This all comes as the fallout of the gun trace task force continues, with 8 officers already convicted of robbing residents, dealing drugs, and relevant to this story, stealing overtime. We asked the police department and the union for comment and if they would comply with the council's request. They have yet to get back to us. But Council President Young says the City Council will not be ignored and that the days of the Baltimore City Police Department spending freely are over.
Now, we want them to be open and transparent, just like the citizens expect us to be. So the information that we request, we expect to get it.
This is Taya Graham and Stephen Janis reporting for the Real News Network in Baltimore City, Maryland.
We'll keep following the story, of course, and it'll be interesting to see if this can actually make a difference with police transparency.
Half of discretionary funds being used.
Yeah,
to
half
pay overtime.
of all of the city's discretionary fund, or to pay the police department. It's wild, and also this comes just like I believe a few weeks after what committee was it? One of the committees that's controlled by the mayor put forth this council resolution to make it so that the excess funds from this one tax would also go to it's the same tax that folks are trying to get funds from for the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. Mm-hmm. So the additional funds from that are proposed to also go to the police. So it seems like this trend of just giving more and more funding to the police department is not really going anywhere anytime
without any accountability on where the funds are going. You saw there that City Solicitor Davis has audit information with details, and they're just refusing to release it under the guise of attorney-client privilege, which is
100%
nonsensical in this moment, but we'll see.
Very much agreed. More police activity happening over east. We heard this week in the continued anti-ICE protests, the immigration policy protests, that there's a possible deportee here in Baltimore with us, Marta Rodriguez. And earlier this week, Jesselyn Noor, one of our reporters, went to one of the, I believe there have been 3 this week, ICE protests over east to demand more accountability. Again, we're seeing the same kinds of issues crop up, whether it's the city police or this federal Homeland Security agency, but these same kinds of problems cropping up over and over again with all kinds of policing in these communities.
We saw this past Thursday, some organizers held a play date in front of ICE to really emphasize the fact that children are being taken away from their families. And here you see the situation with Marta and the idea that you are not American, right? You're not American, even though you're working here legally on a permit. You are paying taxes. You are contributing. It's just un-American.
Yeah, true. Truly. And again, we're seeing the city council respond to this. So let's take a look at the story and then we can talk more about that.
Families, whether at the border or right here in Baltimore City, is immoral and inhumane.
Protests against the Trump administration's immigration policies, which separate parents from their children, are ramping up across the nation. In Baltimore, over 100 people gathered to protest the detention and possible deportation of longtime Maryland resident Marta Rodriguez.
And they've told her that, they want to deport her, and that after so many years and after she even has a work permit and she's been working legally, they've told her that she has to leave from this country, that this is not her country. And it has been devastating news to all of us because no one deserves to be separated from anyone, especially if it's their loved ones. And the immigration status of a person doesn't determine who they are.
Trump is really building on what Obama built during his administration, what Bush built during his administration, going back to Clinton, looking back at U.S. foreign policy over the past couple of decades. I think we need to speak not only to people who may support Trump, but also just in general, we all need to take a look and see how our communities are complicit, and make sure that we're not allowing anybody to advocate for this, and making sure that everybody is being held accountable for their role.
Many people have the concept that people just come here just to, take advantage of whatever is here. And U.S. is known for the land of opportunities. But my mom had to flee her country, one, because she had a very bad relationship with her firstborn in Honduras, in which she suffered from domestic violence. And then because she couldn't provide for all of us. My brother, he's still in Honduras, the oldest, and in those countries, everything is, no one pays attention to what's really going on. They just focus on any bad thing that anyone does here, any immigrant, and they just generalize.
A federal judge will decide Monday whether to extend a July 10th deadline to reunite children under 5 years old with their parents. The government has until July 15th to extend this policy to all children under 18. The ACLU says the Trump administration appears likely to fail to reunite even half of all children by deadline.
There are literally thousands of lawyers and other volunteers ready to help, to go see the parents, to talk to the parents about where their children might be. There are companies ready to provide transportation. There may be hotel groups ready to provide lodging. There are so many people ready to help.
Also in Baltimore, 1st District Councilman Zeke Cohen is introducing a resolution demanding children be reunited with their parents immediately.
So we can't wipe our hands of our history in this country. We have to be honest about our role in destabilizing some of our Central American countries. And we need to play a role now in supporting refugees and immigrants from Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, Mexico, all of these places where violence is a regular occurrence. The United States needs to step up and accept refugees and asylees. What is different in this administration is the zero tolerance policy, the taking away children from their families. And I want to be clear that I think this is a bipartisan failure.
He says he was prompted by the death of a constituent when she was separated from her children and deported back to Honduras.
Recently, I had a constituent also from Honduras, also with a family here in Baltimore, who was arrested, detained, and then deported. 3 months after his deportation, he was murdered outside of his home. People are coming to this country to escape violence and persecution within their own countries. And so the city of Baltimore wants to send a clear message to the Trump administration that we value families and we do not want ICE involved in detaining, arresting, and deporting family members from out of our city.
Institutions who have contracts with ICE and profiting off detention are also drawing protests. In Baltimore, Johns Hopkins University is coming under fire for an ongoing contract for training ICE officers. A petition already has 400 signatures demanding Hopkins end the contract. At the time of publications, Hopkins did not respond to a request for a comment for the story, but when contacted by Money Magazine in June, a Hopkins spokesperson said they were looking into it.
So as you heard in this story, Councilman Zeke Cohen, who's from the 1st District, put forth this resolution to, stop separating children from their families, to reunite children with their families. But again, we'll see how much of a difference the council can make in the face of this huge, swarm of federal policies.
Yeah, I really appreciate that Councilman Cohen for months has been really lifting up challenges that residents in his community is facing as it relates to this. I have to say that it's very easy sometimes for us to look at Hispanic appearing people and not understand the scope of the immigration crisis, right? We have in Northwest Baltimore a heavily Caribbean community.
Yeah.
And you have a number of West African communities here in Baltimore and the surrounding areas. And so we need to be clear that this is an expansive issue and that lots of members of our community are facing undue scrutiny and, frankly, harassment by our federal government.
100%. We have, a Syrian refugee population here in Baltimore. Right. It's especially, I think, in Councilman Cohen's district, you see so many of these populations sort of facing these same kinds of issues over and over again. So,
Right.
yeah, we'll continue to follow, of course.
Brown people unite.
Yeah, 100%. Brown people of the world unite. And on that note, we have a sort of uplifting story to take us out this week. This is a long-form interview on the Mark Steiner Show. Shout out to Mark Steiner. Still every week feel like we need to talk about how we are so happy to have the dulcet tones of Mark Steiner on the Real News Network.
Yeah, I love that guy.
So he sat down this week with Jeff Biggers, who's a really interesting person to me as somebody who focuses on the environment. He sort of came to his understanding of the need for resistance and like the American traditions of resistance because his father was a coal miner. So through that, looked at this long history of rising up against environmental injustices, rising up against white supremacy, and he put together this new book called Resistance: Reclaiming an American Tradition, which he came on the Mark Steiner Show to speak about a little bit this week. It was a really fun interview to watch happen.
It's always great to have people with a wealth of knowledge and depth of analysis who can really, just get to the meat of not only where injustice lives, but where opportunity lives. So it was a great interview to watch.
Yeah, I think that's something that we're trying to do more of here. Just, keep focusing on what opportunities there are for solutions, what things people are trying. So thanks to him for doing that.
Yep.
And see what you think of this.
Hello, folks. This is Mark Steiner, and welcome here to the Mark Steiner Show on the Real News Network. Good to have you with us this week. This book came across. I didn't expect it, but I'm glad it's here. It's by Jeff Biggers, who wrote this book, The United States of Appalachia, which I loved. Never interviewed him for that book. But he's written a new book called Resistance: Reclaiming an American Tradition. And a dear friend of ours, Wayne Carlin, our mutual friend, who is a Vietnam veteran, and I consider one of the dean of Vietnam veteran writers, sent me an email saying, this fellow Jeff Biggers is in town, you should meet him. So here he is in our studios to talk about his book, Resistance: Reclaiming an American Tradition. And that's the book. The stickers don't come with the book. Those are my stickers. But if you make a contribution to Real News, maybe I'll send them to you. You never know. But anyway, we're here with Jeff Biggers. And Jeff, welcome. Good to have you with us.
Thanks much for having me, Mark. Really appreciate it.
Really good to meet you. I mean,
Yes.
I really did like the United States of Appalachia. I thought it was a really significant piece.
You know, it was really a labor of love. Think about it. It's already 13 years ago that I put that out. And I felt like we really needed to go back to our roots, our beginnings, and reframe one of the most maligned and misunderstood regions. And then lo and behold, here we are again in this era of so-called Trump era, where we're often looking at Appalachia as to define. We've had this phenomenon of the Hillbilly Elegy book that everyone's reading, who actually goes back and he casts aspersions and says, it's all your fault. I got out. How come you didn't get out? And he completely misunderstands the history and the social context of Appalachia. So I actually find myself speaking about Appalachia once again.
Because you're a son of Northern Appalachia.
Right, exactly. Right? My roots, of course, come from North Carolina and Virginia, and then they moved on into Kentucky, and then in Southern Illinois, a little part of kind of an undiscovered part of the heartland in the woods.
That's really important stuff. Now, I'm curious, when you wrote this book, Resistance, did you begin writing this before Trump was elected? You must have, right?
No.
No, okay.
No. In fact, I began this book last year, almost when my son realized that Trump had pulled out of the Paris Climate Accords. And I had been thinking...
That's how you start the book.
Right, exactly.
Right,
and it's very much, I'd been thinking about, okay, how do we begin to have a response to this phenomenon of what's going on? And once again, I actually was thinking about maybe writing another book about Appalachia. But my son came to me. He's 12 years old, and here we are now living in Iowa. And he came to me in a very serious way and looked at me and said, Dad, I heard President Trump pulled out of the climate Paris Accords. I said, yes. And he said, is there any hope? And his real question was, is there any hope for our future? And I realized, you can't be glib. You have your kid looking at you. They're actually waiting for an answer. And I could certainly give some kind of lecture about climate action, climate change, and regenerative cities like I've often done. But I said, no, man, we've got to go all the way back to our beginnings, our roots, and really talk about this continuum, this history of resistance, because we're finding ourselves in a position no less than we were a couple hundred years ago.
So this is, to me, key, because I've talked to a lot of people who would say, we're done. We're effed. It's over. That Trump has won and we're just in a horrible shape. And you start the book talking about somebody who was almost a mentor of yours who went to jail with William Sloane Coffin, a great civil rights and anti-war activist that he was from Yale. And the quote you have of his name, you start the book, is "Hope resists, hopelessness adapts."
Right.
So tell me where you think we are in that relationship right now.
You know, I think we often feel like, boy, it's such dark times. It's never been darker than now. You know, we can hardly get up in the morning and we have to have a cup of coffee before we look at our Twitter accounts as, you know, right. What on earth has he said today and what is going wrong? And it's true, we have dark times. You know, we learned today that only 4 children have been reunited with their parents who have been separated due to immigration, flawed immigration policy. Thousands of kids, you know, languishing who knows where in what kind of jail situations. You know, we know it's dark right now, that, you know, 67 major environmental regulations have already been reversed. And we know right now with climate change, yesterday, from Canada all the way down to South America, from Oman to Australia, we hit record heat records. And so we know it is dark times. But I often ask myself, you know, we've been through dark times before. If we speak to our old ones, you know, what they went through World War II, if we speak about our own lifetime, you know, when we were young, who could not use the same water fountain, who were segregated, both in our schools and in our workplace. You know, we know that lynching was just shrugged at within our lifetime. We know that women never had a right not only to have, not own property, but not even to vote 100 years ago. That indigenous people have been displaced for 500 years. That in fact the resistance has been going on ever since the first footprint from abroad came and into the Virginia soil. That we have always gone through these dark times. And so what I wanted to say was, how did we respond? How did we resist? And that begins with indigenous people, it begins with Africans and then eventually African Americans, it begins with our immigrant population, and ultimately it was seeded and manifested in our American Revolution.
So the way you wrote this book is you took really important moments in our history and significant figures and kind of wound them through today's story as well, kind of mixing that with what's happening with Trump in today's world is how you kind of put this piece together, the book together.
Exactly, because everything we're going through today, we've already gone through in the past. And that was also something very important to me to show us that, hey, you know, history is not a blueprint for how we deal with today, but it informs us and it enlightens us and it brings the truth out of the shadows to realize, okay, this is how we dealt with it in the past, and once again, we're going to have to deal with it once again.
So let's start, I mean, this is interesting to me because there are 2 figures in here, let's say, that you talk about a lot throughout the book. And that's the second president of the United States, John Adams, and Tom Paine.
Right.
And we really don't know in many ways who these gentlemen really were and what they really stood for and the complexity of that moment, because it says a lot about the moment we're in right now. When you look at the Adams quotes, we'll talk about that in a little while, we could be looking at Trump quotes,
right,
which is really significant, I think. But let's talk a bit about that. I mean, so from the beginning, this question of the revolution that happened in America, the resistance that people like Adams and others actually had to the revolution when it first took place in the United States. His own racism that came out when he was talking about the Boston Massacre and how that came out, and how the resistance also changed him. So talk a bit about Paine and Adams and why that is so important for us to understand at this moment.
Right. You know, John Adams and this young cat named Alexander Hamilton, who's about 200 years late to get on to Broadway, they said, hey, the country is really broken down to the few and the many, and obviously the few should run it on behalf of the many.
Obviously.
And then here comes Thomas Paine, this wonderful undocumented immigrant who comes across.
Tom Paine, undocumented immigrant. I like that. That's good. Yeah.
Who's a complete failure. He's the dregs of society, twice in debt. He twice broken marriages. You know, he can't even make it as a tax collector in England. You know, and here's someone who gets across on a boat. He gets carried off in a stretcher because he picks up a disease while he's making the great voyage, and he can't find a job. You know, he's the dregs of society, but he's this man who's come here for this very reason of independence. He wants to be part of the resistance in the United States he's heard so much about, that Ben Franklin told him about in London. And Tom Paine was a commoner. And he realized in Philadelphia, it was these young cats that were actually moving the resistance along, and not this kind of timid colonial elite. You know, Benjamin Franklin reprimanded what happened at the Boston Tea Party, and he wrote a letter saying, you should really pay back for all that tea you tossed in there. You know, and there was this movement going on of young people and merchants and workers and the dock workers and African Americans, what Adams called the mongrels, who were really leading the resistance at the point, confronting the British troops, you know, really physically confronting them. And as you note, you know, here John Adams, who was an attorney in Boston, actually represented the British government after the massacre of 1770 when dock workers took on the British troops. Thomas Paine realized we had to say something else, that this temerity had to be confronted, that we had to give a backbone to the American independence movement. You know, even after 1775, the shooting at Lexington and Concord, you know, shot heard around the world, and we often celebrate this as the beginning of our American Revolution, the colonial Congress was terrified. You know, they wrote this letter to the king saying, you know, if it doesn't bother you, we kind of would like to do our own thing, you know, but if that bothers you, we are willing to reconcile. John Hancock. You know, John Hancock had a lot of declarations, and this was called the Olive Branch. And people like Thomas Paine were outraged by that, saying, you know, this brutish man, this brutish leader, this sottish, stupid leader is leading and wrecking mankind. Let's take him on. And so he wrote Common Sense. Published 100,000 copies. It was spread like fire throughout the colonies. People read it and realized, hey, now is the time for us to push toward our independence movement.
So a couple of things for that. There's so many aspects. We could talk about this one aspect for the next hour and a half, but we don't have time to do that.
We're gonna have to have a long program.
We can have a long program.
A series program.
Yeah, series. We could do a series.
Yeah, there you go.
Not a bad idea. Got to bring you back from Iowa.
There you go.
But if you take the particular thing we were just talking about, so Thomas Paine was an agitator and pushed really hard, became the king of the 18th century version of Twitter, as you write about in the book, right? So John Adams becomes president. The resistance pushed him towards a new position. But at the same time, so let's explore that. One of the themes of the book has to do with how resistance movements, even though they might not know it at the moment, actually push remarkable, powerful change and push powerful human beings in power to change, which happened to Adams to an extent.
Exactly.
Right?
It's a great point, Mark, and I really appreciate you pointing that out, because often we feel like, okay, resistance is protest.
Right.
And what's the payoff? What's the direct result from our protest? Not realizing there's this ripple effect, and more importantly, a transformative effect. And that's what Thomas Paine often tried to talk about in his later writings, is the revolution transformed us, but more importantly, we, the people, were able to reclaim the public comments. And so we may not have been part of that discussion, part of those decision-making periods, but we forced the decision makers to listen to us. And we pushed the envelope through the resistance movement to actually change history. And so yes, you had someone like Adams who now suddenly was celebrating the Boston Tea Party, you know, and saying, wow, what a wonderful idea. These people really have an idea. And so when Common Sense comes out, Adams, you know, once again embraces it, even though he's terrified. He says this might be too democratical, was his word.
Democratical, that's a great
that
word.
was his great adjective. And once again, he realized the movement was going without him. And to me, this has incredible relevance to today, that the centrists in the Democratic Party or throughout the country, you know, it's either you're going to lead or get out of the way, but there is this new movement, a vibrant new movement of people in the modern day resistance movement. And by resistance, once again, it's those who are in the streets, those who are in the courts, those who are registering voters, those who are in the city hall, those who are in the school districts, those who are in our communities. The resistance is not a singular phenomenon. It's throughout the board. And I think this movement of resistance is really ultimately that's going to push leaders to make better decisions, or more importantly, create new leaders.
So I want to come back to the resistance and the historical moments that kind of really parallel where we are today. But let's take a couple of them before I get into the third one I've been thinking about after reading your book. The struggles we have today around both immigration and freedom of the press, and the press being attacked. Again, we have this mythology about America, and I've always thought that, you know, until the 1960s, George Washington chopping down the cherry tree, we had this mythology about who we are that was very white and not very real. But the idea of attacking the press is as old as George Washington. It's as old as John Adams. It's as old as the founding of the Republic. What Trump is doing now has its historical antecedents.
Exactly. And so once again, Paine said, to resist is a patriotic duty. It's a fundamental duty to resist duplicitous authority that threatens our democracy, that we have to resist authoritarian spasms, that it's not that we're attacking Trump, not that we're attacking the administration or a conservative Congress. We have to reclaim the idea that we are defending our democracy, and it is they who are attacking us from the outside, that fundamentally we are in charge of this democracy, we the people. And I think that's how Paine reframed it, that we can't just, you know, allow other people to decide our fate for us. So let's get back to the press. You know, here's John Adams. He becomes president after Washington. And John Adams wants to be called His Highness, His Greatness, you know. And once again, he's obsessed. He wants to almost create a House of the Lords for the aristocracy. And he began to be criticized by the journalists who couldn't believe it. And he began to put his own relatives into the government. And then suddenly a journalist realizes, my God, he's colluding with a former enemy who's put money into our elections. Boy, doesn't that sound awfully familiar?
I love that.
Right.
It's an important piece of history because it says a lot about us now, right?
And the journalists found out that thousands of dollars of Great Britain were poured into our elections that helped Adams. You know, think about it, in 1790s. And they began to criticize him. Adams, he couldn't handle that at all. And so he, with the Congress, they passed through this bill. And of course, Alexander Hamilton, who had a super thin skin, if you saw the Broadway show, you know, they actually passed the Sedition Act that said to write, to print, to say anything critical of the Congress, the government, or our president, His Highness, we could put you in prison. It's a crime. And the journalists the next day posted on their newspapers here in Philadelphia, you know, the Aurora, it was published by Benjamin Franklin's grandson, Benjamin Franklin Bache, and Anne Greenleaf in New York, and papers across the country. They put the Constitution on one side and the sedition on the other, and they said, okay, folks, it's either petition or resistance. Which side are you on? And there was this cranky congressman for Vermont. You know, it's always some cranky congressman from Vermont giving us a hard time.
Once again.
His name was Matthew Lyons. He had this great newspaper called The Scourge of Aristocracy. He criticized. He said, we have a president who's obsessed with self-adulation. Boy, that sounds familiar. And they put Matthew Lyons into prison for this, for attacking Adams. First person to go to prison under the Sedition Act. He still ran for Congress, and he won from his jail cell. And once again, it vindicated that the resistance is beyond just the prison walls. Many of our great journalists were hounded. At the same time, they didn't just report the resistance, the journalists led the resistance. They worked with Virginia and Kentucky to come up with a covenant. And to make a long story short, we get to the election of 1800, 2 years later. And it's the journalists who, according to Thomas Jefferson, arrested the rapid march to monarchy. And Jefferson became president, and we threw it out. And so once again, this incredible encroachment by the government, this overreach we're seeing with Trump, you know, once again, Trump calling us the enemy of the people, but more importantly, you know, threatening with libel anybody who criticizes him, has these earlier antecedents. And once again, we have to ask today, what is going to be the role of the journalist to confront Trump and hang on to this tradition of resistance?
These are really important points. It was like the book grabbed me a great deal, as well as your writing about immigration. Again, when people look at the battles of immigration, sometimes we take it back to the Chinese exclusionary laws and laws were passed to keep the Chinese out and then people not wanting Italians and Jews to come in. But this goes deeper. Mm-hmm. I mean, again, the roots of resistance to this and the roots of our battles around immigration go to the very founding of the country.
Exactly.
Right?
You know, I kicked off my book tour in Arizona for a reason. Because I said Arizona was Trump before Trump even came along, you know, and I've written a lot about the immigration battles there, and people who remind us, you know, they didn't cross the border crossed them. And what they remind us too is in 2016, when Trump was elected, they took down Sheriff Joe Arpaio in Maricopa County. And in fact, there's this new movement that's really leading the resistance in Arizona that talks about the role of immigration rights. Our Declaration of Independence, the second most important demand was the right to migrate, that the king would not let us migrate. And so migration was a fundamental credo in our movement for independence that we often forget. You know, Thomas Paine gets to Pennsylvania and he completely debunks this English concept. He said less than a third of the people in Philadelphia are English speakers. You know, what is this thing? We're a nation of immigrants. Thomas Paine said this is the sanctuary, the great role of asylum, that we should be a sanctuary colony, ultimately a sanctuary country. And George Washington agreed with that. In 1801, when Thomas Jefferson became president, in his first address to Congress, he said, we have to correct the mistakes of our immigration policy because John Adams, once again, had the Alien Act allowed him to deport anyone he found dangerous.
This to me, it's a little bit of a digression. But when I think of Thomas Jefferson, and you write about Jefferson obviously in this book a lot, and you write about his contradictions. When he gave that speech, you talk about the contradiction calling Native people savages, and that, you know, and his relationship with Native people, also being a slave owner. Exactly. As was Washington, and you write about Ona Judge in your book, and the woman who escaped from slavery from Washington, and lived to talk about it later. So there's these huge contradictions that are taking place in the very beginning. even with painting a bit around race.
Exactly.
I mean, so that's, and that to me, as you were thinking about this, I'm curious about the role that you think race has played in all of this, in terms of our resistance and what we learned how to create a resistance in many ways from the resistance of Native people and African people in our country, but also that it's what has helped destroy the resistance.
Exactly, and it's a huge question you're asking, and I think I see the resistance.
Because you wrote the book. If you hadn't written the book, I wouldn't ask you the question.
You know, and I see resistance as a truth and reconciliation commission. That what we're doing is repeopling a story that has erased people from it. I've dedicated my career to looking at the role of historicide, how we've removed people from history, including my own people in Southern Illinois, strip mined and removed from history, Appalachians, African Americans, indigenous people, and women. And so my role as a writer of the resistance, as a cultural historian, and the various works I do, is how do we use our history to re-people and re-historicize, not historicide, but historicize, write a new history that is more honest and more compelling account of who we are, the quintessential we the people. And I think the element of ethnicity has been at the crux of this contradiction, but ultimately this challenge. You know, once again, Thomas Paine didn't say, we must live up to the promises of the Declaration of Independence. They weren't promises to him, they were challenges.
Right.
You know, there were no promises at all. You know, the idea was, how are we going to make a more perfect union here? And, you know, after the revolution, he said, we're going to put aside our prejudices, and then we're going to work for a better country. And I think that was the day one after we became a country in 1782, was really the first day of the resistance. Because now we're a country, and now we began to take these seeds of resistance and make them realities in those challenges we're going to go after. And of course, ethnicity is really, I think, the question at the root of what we're talking about today. I mean, I write this book knowing that my teenage son, it's 1 in 10 chance compared to African Americans in terms of him being incarcerated or brutalized by the police today. You know, we know the realities of how we've treated indigenous peoples. You know, I've worked so much work in the borderlands, realizing, you know, the brutality of the police and other situations of people of color and immigrants, you know, to show me your papers laws. And so part of what I want to talk about with the resistance is how through history we've dealt with this. And I can give the example, of course, of Fred Korematsu, the Japanese American who refused to go to the camps, as part of really the fundamental story of what we really wanted to talk about in the American Revolution. That person has to be included. And this includes so many different characters we've talked about that we can continue to talk about, who I feel like really represent the quintessential story, as opposed to just George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and these so-called founding fathers.
It's important to kind of take back the history to bring us the heroes, sheroes, as people like to say, heroines who kind of defined who we were that we'd never think about. You introduced me to some people in this book I've never heard of before. Before we do other things, I just want to talk about at least one of them, which is William Apis. Apis?
Apis, yeah.
So I never heard of William Apis, and I love history. I read history day in and day out. But William Apis is new to me.
Amazing story.
So talk about it, because this is talking about native resistance from its roots.
Right.
After being commingled with the Europeans after colonization. I mean, this is a fascinating piece of our history.
Right, and I appreciate you asking. And people like Ona Judge, once again.
Ona Judge.
One of the enslaved people for George Washington who escaped, and who really, to me, defines the American Revolution, a woman who defied the president. And Maria Stewart, in that same period, you know, this black feminist in Boston, who really talked about white supremacy. You know, we build.
She was so ahead of her time. Again, you introduce us to people like Maria Stewart, who is somebody who's been lost to most of us in history.
Right. So William Apis at Pequot, who had a horrific childhood, who went off to the War of 1812 and then became literate and began to write his memoirs. He wrote a book called The Son of the Forest, which was kind of fanciful. And then he became a Methodist preacher, and he going to church, became, you know, an incredible orator. And then realizing suddenly I'm preaching to white people. You know, and where are the indigenous people? And the people would turn to him and say, well, the Indians are gone. And he would say, well, you're looking at one. You know, and so he began now to realize and reclaim our indigenous history. He did this incredible play based on King Philip's War, which was a 17th century battle between a native leader in New England who took on the British Empire. You know, and he said, this person is as important as George Washington if we want to talk about the American resistance. So in 1833, Apis finds himself on Cape Cod, amongst the Mashpee community, which is still there today. And he says, hey, why don't we invoke the Declaration of Independence? Because they wanted to control their resources. The forests on Cape Cod were being cut down. And so they went and they appealed on July 4th, 1833. And lo and behold, the Massachusetts legislature, these great liberals up there, said, of course, you can have your independence. And it moved forward. But nonetheless, white people came in and began cutting the trees down. And Apis confronted them. They put him in jail for 30 days. And he had this incredible statement where he said, there's nothing you can do because I have my conscience. You can imprison me all you want, but I'm right, and ultimately my conscience will win out, that you can't penalize or jail my conscience. And there was this young student at Harvard, because this was a huge story, a young student nearby at Harvard who read these, and that was Henry David Thoreau. All those people with 3 names are very important. And Henry David Thoreau, of course, thinking, wow, 15 years later, of course, he writes the groundbreaking Civil Disobedience, refusing to pay his taxes for the Mexican-American War. And Henry David Thoreau was amazing. He protected fugitives of John Brown. He was a radical, an incredible person. And of course, his civil disobedience went on to influence not only Martin Luther King and Gandhi, but movements around the country. But we never talked about the fact that it was William Apis who influenced Henry David Thoreau. Yeah, right. It was a Native American who really gave us this fundamental American credo of civil disobedience. And that's something we're seeing today. And Massachusetts is a hotbed of civil disobedience against climate. And I'm thinking, thank you, William Apis.
It's really important what you've done here, I think, in many ways. I mean, making us realize what resistance means, how deep our roots of resistance are in America, that they're not a waste of time, that we don't always see things, pardon me, that occur the moment we're resisting, but the effect that resistance has on this country and on changing things and on the power that erupts from the people is what you've given us, along with these incredible historical figures that many of us never heard of before.
I really appreciate that, and I think that really is one of the great aspects of history itself. We forget that we laid the foundations for a lot of these movements, and it may be 1 or 2 generations later that we actually see the change. And of course, we know that from the Civil Rights Movement. A masterpiece book for me that I read often and look at is Speak Now Against the Day by John Edgerton, who said there was the generation before the generation of the Civil Rights Movement, that there were these crazy people in the Deep South taking on the white ruling class who risked their lives that we'll never know about in the 1920s and the 1930s and the 1940s, who laid the groundwork for what happened in the 1950s and 1960s. And I feel like that often is our work as writers, as historians, but as storytellers, is to collect these stories of people who have laid these seeds of resistance and then ultimately seen them blossom.
So let's take it down to where we are now. I was going to read quotes. We don't have time for a lot of quotes, but you can get the book and check out the quotes yourself, because it's well worth reading. It really is. And you're a good writer, by the way.
Thank you.
I mean that. I would just interview you if I didn't think that, but I'm telling you because I think you are a good writer. And you know how to tell a story, which is really important in a book. Most people don't get. But let's take it to where we are now. And you talk about the regenerative cities, and you talk about young people in the movement today and where people are, and the things that people like Ella Baker and others have said. You talk about towards the end of your book about how Ella Baker was the godmother of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. Said it is up to the young people. Thomas Paine said similar things. So talk a bit about where you think the resistance is now. And by the way, the book is also chock full of great quotes from Trump, which really gives you a sense of his tweets and what he's really thinking and saying and what he's attempting to do with this. But talk a bit about where you think this takes us at this moment.
All right. I think that's one thing about Trump, just to stick on that for a second. These tweets tend to be a distraction.
Right.
But if we really put them in context and actually line them up and look at it, you can really see the inner workings of the chaos at play right now, and really the direction he wants to go in, the very dangerous tendencies of authoritarianism and a crackdown and denial, not only of our liberties, but democracy itself. So I really wanted to put those in to really document, and juxtapose that with how we're resisting. The young people, as Thomas Paine said, we have to take them by the hand and join them. Ella Baker talked about it was young people who have the courage that we don't have. And I think we saw that with the Parkland students in Florida, who immediately afterwards, said it's not a matter about talking and praying anymore. It's a matter about voting and getting people and getting these guys out of office so we can actually pass real gun laws.
Who were inspired by other young people called Black Lives Matter.
Exactly. Exactly, and really talk about the bigger question of why do we have this militaristic presence in our community, and why do we have communities that are dealing with these issues? I think what I really wanted to show was in the last chapter, and I tried to break it down thematically. You know, I look at freedom of speech. I first look at we the people and all the different movements. I look at freedom of speech and freedom of the press. I look at immigration rights and civil rights, and I look at other aspects in terms of anti-war, and then I go on and really look at the environment and climate. And I call this title "Cities of Resistance," because I feel like we often want to blame it on Trump, and it's all this national policy, and well, ultimately there's nothing I can do because it's a federal policy. And my thing is the real resistance has to happen locally. Has to happen in our communities, in our cities, in our towns, and on our campuses, and even in our own homes. And that begins with saying, okay, where does this electricity come from that's powering this program right now? Most likely from a coal-fired plant or a natural gas plant. And what is the external cost to that to our communities? That in Appalachia, we know, we lose 3 coal miners every day from black lung disease. That thousands of people are unable to drink their water. That we have cancer corridors from heavy metals going in from the disastrous fallout of coal mining. That we have to begin the process of saying, okay, if we truly are going to resist, we have to bring it down to our day-to-day operations of how we live. And that is our energy production, our food production, our transportation systems, our urban planning, and how we design places that both segregate us from each other and how we can begin to heal and bring our communities back together. That ultimately resistance is an act of renewal. Thomas Paine said we have it in our power to reinvent the world. And I think we've reached that moment. We need to do that. My last chapter brings up one of the old Paul Reveres of ecology, Barry Commoner, who warned us in 1971, and that great, Brooklyn accent he had is, I don't know if, capitalism is going to work. Can it be in parallel with environmental preservation? He asked us 50 years ago. And I think that kind of question has to be on the table now. How do we begin to shift? And I think a lot of young democratic socialists are asking that question. How do we rein in the excesses of what we're seeing with capitalism today? Because essentially is not going to equate to a sustainable future in terms of the environment. And so I think step by step, we're seeing young people willing to consider new ideas and willing to put their bodies on the line, both in terms of civil disobedience, in terms of protest, in terms of like the young students in Phoenix who went to my reading, 109 degrees out there doing voter registration, to turn around their cities, but in a way that they can create a regenerative city, a city that begins to produce what it needs as a functioning, sustainable city. And that, to me, is ultimately going to be one of the great resistance. It's inclusionary, it's based on justice, it's based on environmental justice, and it ultimately looks at how we are going to begin to reverse the process of this decline that we're in right now.
Which is why this book, I think, is a very important read for all of us. We're at a place now where the Supreme Court could be taking us backwards, but the resistance is pushing us forwards. And that resistance is nothing new. The resistance has been part of our country since the beginning. The book, again, Resistance, Reclaiming an American Tradition by Jeff Biggers. And Jeff, thank you for joining us. Great to have you here in the studio.
Thanks for having me, Mark. It's a real honor.
Really good to have you here.
Great.
And he's off to Philadelphia now to do another book conversation. And it's good to have him here. And I'm Mark Steiner for the Real News Network. Talk to you all next week.
So if you liked what you just heard, any of the 3 pieces you just heard, if you enjoy listening to us, we should remind you that we are currently in the middle of our summer fundraiser.
Show me the money.
Show me the money.
Or make it rain.
Yeah, please make it rain. You could throw us a coin.
Yeah, it's Friday the 13th. Let's get yourself some good juju and contribute to independent news, independent voices, by the people, for the people, not supported by corporate dollars, but by people power.
Yeah, and so on that note, we will go out this week on a fundraising pitch that we made here at The Real News. But really, it's not just we're not just asking for your money. This is also a way that you can learn a little bit about all of the facets of our coverage. Some of you might know our Baltimore bureau the best, which is awesome, and we're very happy about that. But just a reminder that we also do international and national coverage here. We have spent the majority of our resources here are actually spent not doing just local news, but trying to connect the bigger picture to the smallest hyperlocal picture. So take a look, and if you are convinced, consider maybe throwing us a coin.
Yeah. www.therealnews.com/donate.
We just took it way back. http://
Should give the whole thing.
So I was in a taxi cab in Chicago, and the taxi driver asks me, "What do you do?" And I said, "I work for this new news network. Doesn't take corporate funding or government money, doesn't sell advertising." And he said, "Oh, you mean The Real News?" And I knew that was it. That was going to be the name.
Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Piris.
This is Shahayal Tajvidi.
My name is Thomas Hedges.
I'm Dharna and Khalilah.
We're here in front of the Greek Parliament where a very large crowd is gathering.
The site of the unrest 1 year ago after Freddie Gray was killed in police custody.
We're here in the town of Westminster, Maryland.
Manchester, New Hampshire for the primaries of the Democratic Party.
Washington, D.C. at the National Press Club.
Live from Ferguson, Missouri.
I'm Sharmini Piris coming to you from Athens.
Jessica Devereaux coming to you from Capitol Hill.
I'm Kayla Rivara, and this is the Real News of the Day.
We're not doing the news just to understand. We're doing it because we want to make a difference. We want to make change. We don't want to live in a world of perpetual war and climate disasters and eroding living standards and chronic poverty. And we've realized that if we're going to make that difference, we need to talk to the people who need the change the most. That's working and poor people. That's why we're based in Baltimore.
The main idea of the name The Real News is that there's an objective world where economic interests dominate.
When you look at a police department, their primary mission is to protect wealth and property.
They think that they can do what they want to do, and the citizens have lost confidence.
I want to get back to your office.
But our role isn't just to report and expose. We go beyond critique and strive to answer the question, what are effective solutions?
When we covered the Baltimore protests against the murder of Freddie Gray and systemic police abuse, we said that the real problem was not just a few racist cops, but the role of police in enforcing laws that perpetuate chronic poverty and mass incarceration. Police act as a buffer between those who own stuff and those who don't. The more you own, the more you are served and protected.
The Real News gave a voice to the people most affected. For example, we hosted a town hall in a parking lot in Gilmore Homes, the community where Freddie Gray grew up.
We decided to have a town hall meeting today.
The little white children be in their neighborhoods. They got skateboard rings, playgrounds, soft Christian mats on their courts. Our children got the concrete jungle. Then they wonder why they so hard and so disrespectful. They don't have nothing to respect. What the hell do they have? Nothing.
The weakness of independent news sources, including ours, is that they have yet to capture a broad mass audience. Corporate media dominates.
We think the weak link in the corporate media chain exists in certain local markets. For example, the advertising-driven model of Baltimore's local television news leads it to target the mostly white and wealthy audience in Baltimore County. That's why 75% of their on-air talent is white in a city that's 65% black.
Of course, the issue is much deeper than who's on air. In a city where there were 348 murders in 2015, that's as many murders as New York, a city 13 times the size of Baltimore, local news turned tragedy into morbid infotainment. They don't ask questions that might lead to transformative change. They don't challenge those who have real power because they're owned by people who have such power. The nonprofit model of The Real News allows us to take on these issues with imagination and courage. We can win a major share of the Baltimore City audience. And when we do, it's a game changer. We call our strategy Go Local to Go Global, because if we can do this in Baltimore, we can do it in cities across North America and even around the world.
Our plan is to develop news, analysis, and cultural programs that will break through to a Baltimore audience. We will deepen our investigative work and debate solutions in town halls held in our downtown studios. They'll be live streamed and on television. We're producing a daily news and commentary show on local television and developing Real News Radio. We're opening a restaurant event space that features local artists and cultural events that strengthen our ties with the community.
As I seen him on his phone, walking, talking, minding his own. Boom, a shot from my hands where I stood. All I seen flying was a phone in the hood.
We're sending a team to Westminster, a working-class town near Baltimore that's mostly white and supports Trump. We'll be investigating the community's concerns and explore what real solutions look like.
The biggest thing here in Westminster is
A lot of drugs. Selling drugs, you go anywhere in Westminster City and see it.
We're building an institute that's a collaboration of investigative journalists, academics, and frontline workers like teachers and nurses and cops and community activists that will answer the question, if you ran Maryland and Baltimore in the interests of the majority of its people, what policies would you create?
It's going to be more than news. It's going to be community mobilization, community enlightenment, community morale, and really focus not just on telling people what's going on that's not very good in Baltimore, but telling them what's going on that is good, all the way to solutions for a better life for the people in this big city.
We will strengthen our team in D.C., focusing on the real interests that drive Washington policy and expose the mainstreaming of racism, Islamophobia, and far-right ideologies in American national politics and media. TRNN is one of the few independent news networks accredited on Capitol Hill.
Very importantly, we will expand our Climate Change Bureau and stress the urgency of the environmental crisis, expose the war on science, and report on creative and necessary solutions, recovering everything from global rising temperatures to toxic waste dumps in Baltimore.
When reality asserts itself, I talk to leading thinkers and activists and find out what were the formative experiences that shaped their political worldview. It's also a place to explore the major issues of our times with a sense of history and a consciousness of class and race. Most importantly, it's a place for people who want change to discuss and debate what should be done next.
I'm Eddie Conway. Welcome to Rattling the Bars. In Maryland, 2,100 inmates are serving life with the possibility of parole.
We will increase our coverage of the foreign policy of the 1% and its devastating impacts. We will report on mass movements around the world that are resisting austerity, war, and aggression.
Real News is in the house, building the world house that Martin King and so many others envisioned. Please support Real News.
I'm grateful for the Real News Network for bringing true news to people and communities who need it most.
We know that this is an ambitious plan, but the time's quite out for it. Please help us make real news.
Make a tax-deductible donation today at therealnews.com.